Let's ask a question that sounds almost too simple. What actually takes away someone's independence after 70? Most people guess wrong. They picture a heart attack, a stroke, cancer, the dramatic villains. But talk to anyone who works in geriatric medicine and you'll hear a quieter, less cinematic answer over and over. A fall, that's it, not a disease, not some invisible internal failure. A person is standing and then, for one fraction of a second, they aren't anymore. And that one moment, a slip on a wet bathroom floor, a stumble over a curb, a misjudged step off a rug, can end up being the hinge point of an entire life. A hip fracture at 75 isn't just a broken bone. It's often the first domino in a chain. Surgery, weeks in a hospital bed, muscle loss from lying still, a body that never quite gets its old strength back, and sometimes a person who never returns to living fully on their own again. This is why doctors treat falls so seriously. Not because the fall itself is dramatic, but because of everything that tends to follow it. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If falling is this dangerous, why does almost nobody train specifically to prevent it? We spend our whole lives building strength, maybe watching our diet, maybe going for walks, but almost nobody practices the actual skill of staying upright. And balance is a skill. It's not a fixed trait you either have or don't, like eye color. It's closer to riding a bicycle or playing an instrument. Something your nervous system gets good at through repetition, and something it quietly forgets when you stop practicing. Here's what's happening under the hood, in plain terms. Balance depends on three systems talking to each other constantly. Your eyes, the fluid in your inner ear, and sensors in your feet and joints that tell your brain where your body is in space. When you're young, this conversation happens instantly and automatically. You don't even know it's occurring. But as you age, all three of these systems get a little slower, a little less precise, unless you keep using them. And here's the frustrating part. Everyday modern life doesn't ask much of your balance. You sit in chairs with backs, you walk on flat, predictable sidewalks, you hold railings. All of that is comfortable, and all of that is quietly letting the skill atrophy, the same way a muscle atrophies from disuse, which means the fix isn't complicated, it's just neglected. You have to deliberately put your balance system back to work, the same way you'd put a muscle back to work. Standing on one foot while brushing your teeth in the morning. Walking heel to toe down a hallway like a tightrope walker, one foot directly in front of the other. Practicing standing up from a chair without using your hands or the armrests. Even something as simple as closing your eyes for a few seconds while standing still, carefully, near something to hold on to, forces your inner ear and your feet to do more of the work your eyes usually cover for. None of this requires equipment. None of it requires a gym membership or an instructor. It requires about 5 minutes a day and a willingness to feel a little wobbly and unsure at first, which, ironically, is exactly the sensation you're training your body to handle better. Think of it this way. Nobody buys home insurance because they expect their house to burn down. They buy it because Let's ask a question that sounds almost too simple. What actually takes away someone's independence after 70? Most people guess wrong. They picture a heart attack, a stroke, cancer, the dramatic villains. But talk to anyone who works in geriatric medicine and you'll hear a quieter, less cinematic answer over and over. A fall? That's it. Not a disease. Not some invisible internal failure. A person is standing and then, for one fraction of a second, they aren't anymore. And that one moment, a slip on a wet bathroom floor, a stumble over a curb, a misjudged step off a rug, can end up being the hinge point of an entire life. A hip fracture at 75 isn't just a broken bone. It's often the first domino in a chain. Surgery, weeks in a hospital bed, muscle loss from lying still, a body that never quite gets its old strength back, and sometimes a person who never returns to living fully on their own again. This is why doctors treat falls so seriously, not because the fall itself is dramatic, but because of everything that tends to follow it. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If falling is this dangerous, why does almost nobody train specifically to prevent it? We spend our whole lives building strength, maybe watching our diet, maybe going for walks, but almost nobody practices the actual skill of staying upright. And balance is a skill. It's not a fixed trait you either have or don't, like eye color. It's closer to riding a bicycle or playing an instrument. Something your nervous system gets good at through repetition, and something it quietly forgets when you stop practicing. Here's what's happening under the hood, in plain terms. Balance depends on three systems constantly talking to each other: your eyes, the fluid-filled canals in your inner ear, and sensors in your feet and joints that tell your brain where your body is in space at any given moment. When you're young, this conversation happens instantly and automatically. You never even notice it's occurring. But as you age, all three of these systems get a little slower and a little less precise unless you keep using them. And here's the frustrating part. Everyday modern life doesn't ask much of your balance anymore. You sit in chairs with backs and armrests. You walk on flat, predictable sidewalks. You hold railings without thinking about it. All of that is comfortable, and all of that is quietly letting the skill atrophy the same way an unused muscle shrinks. Which means the fix isn't complicated. It's just neglected. You have to deliberately put your balance system back to work the same way you'd put a muscle back to work at the gym. Standing on one foot while brushing your teeth in the morning. Walking heel to toe down a hallway, one foot placed directly in front of the other, like a tightrope walker. Practicing standing up from a chair without pushing off with your hands. Even something as simple as staying still with your eyes closed for a few seconds, carefully, near a wall or counter you can grab, forces your inner ear and your feet to do more of the work your eyes usually cover for you. None of this requires equipment. None of it requires a gym membership or a personal trainer. It requires about 5 minutes a day and a willingness to feel a little wobbly at first, which, ironically, is exactly the sensation you're training your body to handle better and better. Think of it this way. Nobody buys home insurance because they expect their house to burn down. They buy it because if it did, they'd want to already have something in place to catch the fall. Balance training is the same idea, except the thing you're protecting isn't a house, it's your ability to live in your own body, on your own terms, for as long as possible. 5 minutes a day, done consistently for years, is a remarkably small price for that kind of protection. Most people just never think to pay it until after the fall has already happened. And by then, the insurance window has closed. Most people think of cardiovascular exercise as something you do for your heart. Like it's a favor to one specific organ, sitting off in its own corner of the body, doing its own private job. But that picture is too small. What's actually happening every time your heart rate goes up is much bigger. You're improving the delivery system for oxygen to every single tissue in your body, and the tissue that benefits most dramatically, the one nobody talks about, is your brain. Here's the simple version of what's going on. Your brain is an incredibly hungry organ. It's only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses roughly 20% of the oxygen you breathe in. It has no way to store extra fuel for later. It needs a constant, fresh, reliable supply, delivered minute by minute through blood flow. So when your heart is strong and your blood vessels are flexible and clear, that supply arrives easily. But when the cardiovascular system gets sluggish, when the heart is out of practice, and the blood vessels get stiffer with age and inactivity, that oxygen delivery becomes less efficient. And a brain that's getting a slightly worse supply of oxygen and nutrients doesn't announce it with an alarm bell. It just quietly gets a little foggier, a little slower to find the right word, a little less sharp in conversation. People chalk this up to getting older, when a meaningful piece of it is really just a supply chain problem. This is why the research keeps landing on the same finding, over and over, across different countries and different studies. People who do regular cardiovascular activity tend to maintain sharper memory, better mood, and slower cognitive decline than people who don't, even when researchers try to account for other factors like diet and genetics. The heart and the brain aren't just neighbors. They're roommates who share resources, and when one of them is thriving, the other tends to benefit directly. There's a second piece to this too, less talked about, but just as real. Aerobic exercise appears to stimulate the growth of new connections between brain cells and even supports the birth of new cells in regions tied to memory. Movement isn't just keeping the brain fed. It may be helping the brain actually rebuild and adapt at any age. That's a remarkable thing when you sit with it. A simple walk isn't just good for your heart. It might be one of the more powerful tools available for protecting the mind. So what does this actually look like in practice? It's not about training like an athlete. You don't need to run, and you certainly don't need to chase some intense heart rate zone on a smartwatch. What you're looking for is simple and almost old-fashioned movement that leaves you slightly out of breath, but still able to hold a conversation. a brisk walk, swimming a few laps, riding a bike around the neighborhood, dancing in your kitchen to a song you like. Even briskly pushing a shopping cart through a grocery store counts for something. The goal is 20 to 30 minutes, most days of the week, of something that gets your heart working a bit harder than sitting still does. What matters most isn't intensity, it's consistency. A body that gets asked to pump blood a little faster on a regular basis stays practiced at doing it well. A body that never gets asked gradually loses that capacity, the same way any unused skill fades. So the next time someone frames cardio as just heart health, it's worth gently correcting the picture. It's not one organ being maintained in isolation. It's a partnership. The heart doing its job so the brain can keep doing its. Take care of the pump, and you're quietly taking care of the mind that depends on it. That's not a small side benefit. For a lot of people entering their 70s, it might be one of the most important reasons to keep moving at all. Picture two roommates sharing an apartment. One of them handles all the deliveries, groceries, packages, everything the household needs to function. The other one depends entirely on those deliveries arriving on time because it has no pantry of its own, no way to stockpile supplies for a rainy day. That's not a bad description of the relationship between your heart and your brain. The heart is the delivery system. The brain is the roommate with zero storage space, running almost entirely on what shows up fresh, minute to minute. This is easy to forget because the two organs feel like they belong to completely different conversations. Heart health gets filed under cardiovascular. Memory and sharpness get filed under cognitive. But biologically, they're far more entangled than those separate filing categories suggest. Your brain, despite being a small fraction of your total body weight, consumes an outsized share of the oxygen you breathe, somewhere around 1/5 of it, by most estimates. And because it can't bank that oxygen for later, it depends completely on steady, well-functioning blood flow to keep firing properly, second by second. So here's the mechanism worth understanding. When you raise your heart rate through movement, you're not just giving your heart a workout, you're training the entire delivery pipeline. The heart pumps more efficiently. Blood vessels stay more flexible instead of stiffening. Circulation improves throughout the body, including, crucially, up into the brain. Do this consistently over months and years, and you're essentially keeping the roads open and well paved for a resource your brain can't survive without. Now flip it around. What happens when this system goes unused? Nothing dramatic. At first, that's exactly the problem. There's no single moment where you notice oxygen delivery declining. It shows up instead as things people write off as ordinary aging. A little more forgetfulness, a little more trouble finding the right word mid-sentence, a mental fog that wasn't there a decade ago. Some of that is genuinely part of aging, but a meaningful piece of it is something closer to a maintenance issue. A supply chain that's been allowed to get sluggish from disuse. This is precisely why researchers keep finding the same pattern, study after study, population after population. People who move their bodies regularly tend to hold on to sharper memory, better mood, and slower cognitive decline than people who don't, a gap that persists even after accounting for diet, education, and genetics. There's also something happening at a more structural level. Aerobic activity appears to encourage the brain to form new connections between cells and even to support the growth of new cells in regions tied directly to memory. So the benefit isn't only better delivery of what's already there. Movement may actually help the brain build new capacity at almost any age. None of this requires turning yourself into an athlete. The goal isn't a personal best or a heart rate zone glowing on a smartwatch. It's simply asking your heart to work a bit harder than it does while sitting still on a regular basis. A brisk walk around the block, a few laps in a pool, a bike ride at an easy pace. Even pushing a shopping cart briskly through a grocery store, if you're paying attention, counts for something. A good rule of thumb, you should be breathing harder than normal, but still able to hold a conversation. Aim for something like 20 to 30 minutes, most days of the week. What matters most isn't intensity, it's consistency. A heart that's regularly asked to pump a little faster stays practiced at doing exactly that. A heart that's rarely asked loses that capacity gradually, the same way any skill fades from disuse, quietly, without an announcement, until one day it's simply gone. So the next time cardiovascular exercise gets filed away as just heart health, it's worth widening the picture. You're not maintaining one organ in isolation. You're maintaining a partnership, keeping the delivery system strong enough that the roommate depending on it can keep doing its job too. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly discovers they can't turn their head to check a blind spot or reach the top shelf of a cabinet. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of some hidden disease lurking in the joints. It happens the way most quiet losses happen, one unused degree of motion at a time, so gradually that you never notice the exact moment it started, only the moment you realize it's already gone. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. Your joints don't just have a range of motion the way a hinge has a fixed swing. Range of motion is closer to a rented space. If you stop using the full amount available to you, your body starts treating that unused portion as unnecessary. Connective tissue around the joint gradually tightens. Muscles that used to stretch through a full arc get used to operating through a smaller one. Over years, the body quietly downsizes your movement to match your habits. Sit in chairs all day, and your hips forget how to open fully. Keep your arms mostly below shoulder height, and your shoulders forget how to reach overhead without protest. It's not damage. It's adaptation, your body being efficient, in the worst possible way, by shrinking to fit whatever you actually ask of it. This is why stiffness sneaks up on people who never did anything to deserve it. They didn't injure themselves. They simply spent years quietly asking less and less of their joints, and their joints, being obedient, complied. The consequences aren't dramatic at first. A little more trouble reaching behind your back to fasten something, a little more caution turning to look over your shoulder while driving, a little more effort getting down to tie a shoe. But these small losses compound. Someone who can't rotate their spine easily starts avoiding movements that require it. Someone who can't lift their arm comfortably overhead starts finding workarounds instead of reaching. And each workaround is one more signal to the body that the fuller range isn't needed, which locks the pattern in even tighter. It's a slow spiral, and by the time it's noticeable, people often assume it's just what happens with age, rather than recognizing it as something that was, in large part, optional. Here's the good news, and it's a genuinely encouraging one. Joints respond to being used again at almost any age. This isn't like rebuilding lost muscle, which takes real time and effort. Mobility tends to respond faster because you're not creating new tissue, you're simply reminding existing tissue that this range still matters. Gently rotating the hips in a slow circle. Reaching both arms overhead and holding for a few breaths. Twisting the torso side to side while seated, hands on opposite shoulders. Rolling the shoulders back and up in slow, full circles. Tilting the head gently side to side and forward and back. None of this needs to look impressive. It's not about touching your toes or doing the splits. It's about maintaining enough range to live a full, unrestricted daily life. Turning to see a car in the next lane, reaching a top cabinet without dragging over a stool, bending to pick something up off the floor without a production out of it, 5 or 10 minutes a day is genuinely enough, done consistently, ideally when muscles are a little warm, after a short walk or in the shower or before bed. The goal isn't flexibility as a performance, it's flexibility as freedom. The freedom to move through an ordinary day without your own body being the thing standing in your way. So the honest reframing is this: stiffness isn't really a symptom of aging, it's more accurately a symptom of stillness. And stillness is one of the few things on this list that's genuinely fully within your control. Every joint you keep moving through its full range today is one more joint that won't have quietly shrunk its world by the time you actually need it. There's a strange thing about this particular 10-year window that almost nobody explains honestly, and it's this: 65 to 75 doesn't feel dramatic while you're living through it. There's no single alarming event, no obvious before and after. You wake up most mornings feeling roughly like you did the day before, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because underneath that quiet, unremarkable surface, something significant is happening. This decade is quietly deciding which direction the next 20 years are going to go. Here's the honest way to think about it. Aging isn't a cliff, it's a slope, and slopes have momentum. Every decade of adult life sets up the terrain for the one that follows. But 65 to 75 carries a special weight because it's the last decade where the body still has enough reserve, enough muscle, enough balance, enough cardiovascular capacity to meaningfully respond to what you do with it. Push into your 80s and 90s, having spent your late 60s and early 70s active and engaged, and you arrive there with a body that still has margin, still has room to adapt to whatever comes. Spend those same years sitting more, moving less, letting strength and balance and mobility quietly erode, and you arrive at 80 with much less margin, at exactly the point in life when margin matters most. This is the part nobody tells you clearly enough. Decline doesn't happen at a steady, linear pace. It compounds. Losing a bit of muscle makes you a little less steady. Being a little less steady makes you a little more cautious about moving. Moving less accelerates the muscle loss. Each small loss quietly sets up the conditions for the next one, the way a small snowball rolling downhill picks up more snow with every rotation. By the time the decline becomes visible enough to worry about, the momentum has often already been building for years. That's why so many people describe their 80s as suddenly difficult. It wasn't sudden. It was accumulating the entire time, mostly during the very decade that felt too ordinary to take seriously. And this is precisely why 65 to 75 deserves to be treated as the most important decade of the whole process, even though it rarely gets the attention. It's not the decade where things visibly fall apart. It's the decade where the decisions get made about whether things fall apart later or not. The muscle you build now is muscle you'll be drawing on in your 80s. The balance you train now is the balance that keeps you upright when a curb catches you off guard at 84. The mobility you preserve now is the mobility that lets you keep bending, reaching, and turning long after your peers have quietly stopped. Every one of the four things already covered: strength, balance, cardiovascular fitness, mobility has its highest leverage point right here in this exact window, precisely because the body still has enough capacity left to respond meaningfully to the effort. This is also, honestly, why this age range gets called the hardest stage of life by people who've lived through it, not because it's physically the most painful, but because it's the stage that asks the most of your discipline while offering the least dramatic feedback. Nobody claps when you do your balance exercises at 68. Nothing visibly changes after a week of strength training at 71. The rewards are real, but they're slow, quiet, and delayed, which makes it easy to skip today and easy to skip again tomorrow without ever feeling the immediate cost. But here's the reframe worth holding on to. This decade isn't the beginning of the end. It's closer to the last checkpoint where you still get to choose the ending. Nobody can hand these years back to you later, and nobody can do the work for you now. But the decade itself is generous in one specific way: it still responds to effort. The body at 65 to 75 is still listening. What it hears from you during these 10 years is, in large part, what it will hand back to you for the 10, 20, or 30 after that.